Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly roundup of the world's news. And we're just talking before we get started. This was a good news week. Here to talk about this week is Philip Stevens, who is the chief political editor and director of the editorial board of the Financial Times and author of a new book out later this month called Britain Alone. Philip, wonderful to have you with us. Nirmal Ghosh, who is the U.S. bureau chief of the Straits Times. Nirmal, wonderful to have you back as well. And Susan Glasser, staff writer for The New Yorker. Wonderful to have you back as well, Susan. So let me start with you. You had your final Trump column on Trump's Washington, your first column on Biden's Washington. How would you sum up the week when it came to the United States, the end of one era and the beginning of another era?
Well, thank you very much, Ivo, for having me back. Yes, I successfully transitioned the column along with the country having successfully transitioned, one way or the other at noon, or just a little bit before noon, actually, on Wednesday, January 20th. And, never has it taken so much for what we used to take for granted as the normal functioning of our constitutional system. We've imbued it with a new drama over the last couple months. I imagine that many of your listeners, as well as all of us, are deeply familiar now with the process of electoral college certification and various nuances of various state ballot counting laws. So, I'm not sure if we'll even remember this period a few years from now. It really was a remarkable scene on Wednesday. I've gone to inaugurations, going back to Bill Clinton's first inauguration in 1993, and certainly none of us have ever seen anything like the sort of occupying force of more than 20,000 troops that were here, essentially to shut down Washington. Like many people here, we basically could not leave our homes. We did go and sort of see the fortifications day or two before the inauguration, and it just, it was an eerie thing. The Capitol essentially deserted. I went and covered, the three I's of January Wednesdays, right? Insurrection, impeachment, and then inauguration. Never was it such a relief to hear politicians say the old expected things, that sort of wrapping essentially what we used to take for granted as patriotic cliches about the United States, sounded newsy and revelatory and, soothing in some way. So look, there's a lot that will happen. The world has not waited for America to get its act together in the last 4 years, and that I'm sure will be the subject of this conversation. But I will say that, there was this moment when former President George W. Bush went up to Jim Clyburn, the congressman from South Carolina, who famously endorsed Joe Biden a little less than a year ago and essentially rescued his presidential reign. We forget this, but a year ago, actually, Joe Biden was not winning the Democratic primaries, and because whether Bernie Sanders was going to become the nominee, he had a strong lead in the polls. Biden had lost both New Hampshire and Iowa. And it really was Jim Clyburn, the Democratic whip from South Carolina, the leading Black politician in that state, and really in some ways in the country, the highest ranking of the Democratic leadership in the House. He not only endorsed Biden, but he threw everything behind him. He rescued his campaign. And so there's this incredible moment, flash forward to the inauguration, where George W. Bush goes up to Clyburn. And remember, Bush loathed Donald Trump. And, he has not been speaking volubly against him, but he certainly voted against him in 2016 and also again in 2020. And, Bush in 2016 at the first inaugural sat next to Hillary Clinton and famously told her, after listening to that American Carnage inaugural address, well, that was some weird shit, Hillary, which in some ways I think a perfect epigraph, for this last 4 years. Well, Bush goes up to Clyburn and he says to Clyburn, not only thank you, but you saved our democracy, you saved our country. And Joe Biden was the only person who could have beaten Donald Trump, and therefore you saved all of us. And I just thought, yeah, that was, and oddly enough, George W. Bush, not famous for his silver tongue, might have had the two best quotes of the Trump era to bookend them.
Terrifically reminder that there is a continuity despite all the discontinuity, not only by the presence of three former presidents, and of course Jimmy Carter, who couldn't be there because at age 96 traveling to COVID, given what's happening on COVID and everything else, wasn't able to be. And Nirmal, when you watch this, you were also in Washington, but of course with an eye for your readers over in South Asia. What was your experience of it? The sort of the return to normality, something that we've done for 200 plus years here in the United States, but at the same time we're thinking we might lose at some point. Nirmal, how was it seen from your perspective?
Yes, actually, the message I got from it was that, look, this is a place where just 2 weeks previously it had been overrun by a violent mob, smashing windows, bashing down doors, battering policemen, one policeman with a fire extinguisher. It was an absolutely horrendous scene. And the image of the United States got badly dented over the world, as we know, right? So the very fact that this happened successfully was a reaffirmation of the due processes of democracy. And of course, it took 25,000 armed troops to get it done, but so be it, it worked, right? So that was the message. And the other message that I tried to put across in my writing was, what is the lesson of this? The lesson is that democracy is fragile. One should never take anything for granted. And the lesson that should be learned from the Trump era is that ruling elites, elite establishments should also not take people for granted, because they leave space for populist demagogues to sequester part of the vote and come to power. That is the lesson, and I hope that lesson has been learned. Otherwise, I mean, as we know, it's not going to be rosy, right? I mean, it was a nice moment on Wednesday, and it was perfect mix, I should say. I'm glad, Susan, you brought up the fact that Joe Biden just 2 years ago seemed to be destined for a sort of dignified retirement, but he rose to the occasion, which was quite remarkable. His speech was perfectly balanced. It was firm yet compassionate, also aspirational. He did mention white supremacy. He called it out. He used the term. And he talked about, the manipulation of facts and so forth. So it was a very good mix. And then the whole choreography was very well done. I think America and the world needed to see this. And I think definitely a very positive event, hopefully one that will at least somewhat stick in the weeks to come.
Philip, watching it from London, you said you were there from beginning to end. How did the people in Britain, the people in Europe, experience the events of the week?
I think the first thing to say is there was a much sharper interest in this inauguration than in many. I mean, I think after Barack Obama won his first term, that inauguration was very, very important. But American inaugurations are not things that normally get people to have their TV sets, but this one certainly did. I think a friend of mine who works with the government, in fact, in the Prime Minister's office, said it's the time we've watched the news from Washington and smiled for several years. It was good news from Washington. And I think with the unpredictability, irascibility of the previous administration, just having this return to normality, to convention, to politeness and respect is greatly appreciated. Now, look, I don't think anyone thinks everything's going to be perfect in the transatlantic relationship or between all the Western allies over the next 4 years. But I think there is a strong view we've got another chance. We have a chance now to set down some agreements, some understandings, to reestablish some norms that will, if you like, put together the West after the shaking it's had of the last few years.
Susan, pick up here for a second and sort of, Biden's entire, most of the inauguration and most of the first steps have been rightly, of course, focused on COVID and the coronavirus and the damage that has been done. But Biden is if anything, a foreign policy animal. He's been in foreign policy for 50 years, been part of the debate. He also has expectations for the world. And have we seen first indications of what those expectations are?
Yes, absolutely. Look, atmospherics is going to be the softball pitch to Joe Biden at the beginning when it comes to resetting America's with the world. Not only, as Nirmal pointed out, just the sheer optics of an America that seems like America again, broadcast around the world with people paying a lot closer attention than they normally do. But look, we saw the same thing happen when George W. Bush was succeeded by Barack Obama, and you did have a sort of a global of relief and a dramatic switch in how the United States and its leader was viewed around the world. So you'll see something very comparable, obviously, in these initial days. If anything, Joe Biden might be more popular among some of our traditional allies in Europe than he will be here in the United States. However, I think there's a couple quick areas to watch. I mean, first of all, there is clearly the big macro question of what does America word mean anymore in the world? And there's a recognition even among European governments that are extremely delighted with the change in administration, a recognition that America remains a deeply polarized country in which 74 million Americans, more than 4 years, voted for Donald Trump, even after everything that he did, and that the old certainties that they thought they understood about the United States, and certainly about the United States and foreign policy, might not apply. And therefore, there's a real question about, well, America might say it's ready to reassert leadership, but what does this word mean? Why negotiate an Iran deal with the United States if in 4 years a new gang is going to come in and throw that right out? So number one is, what does it mean for American credibility as part of leadership? And obviously, it's an indispensable part of it. And then number two, of course, is also the even sort of more intangible, but question of what long-term damage done to the American brand, which in foreign policy always had something in a way to do with this idea of freedom and our own democracy being so visibly troubled in the world. What does it do when we critique other governments like China over its human rights abuses happening in Hong Kong? You saw Tony Blinken, the nominee for Secretary of State. We anticipate that he will be confirmed in the coming days. You saw him going his way to appeal to the Republican senators he wants to vote for his confirmation, but saying, well, you're not wrong about everything. For example, in his final days, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, widely loathed, I should say, by Democrats as nonpartisan State Department officials, he designated the Chinese placement of the Uyghurs in concentration camps as a, quote, act of genocide. Tony Blinken at his confirmation hearing said he actually agreed, which was really disarming to Lindsey Graham and other Republicans who were sort of teed up to have an argument with him. And so I think there is this question about what does it mean when we're going to have a values-based foreign policy at a time when American values are seen as struggling at home. But they do plan and anticipate really showcasing foreign policy in February as a first effort to show a renewed change in administration. And you're not going to have a president of the United States anymore who's sort of befuddling the world with praise for autocrats and public abuse for allies. That's just going to be a dramatic shift on the front end.
When you walk around Washington, or in fact, Zoom around Washington and call around Washington, because we don't walk around as even as journalists as we used to, and start talking to people within the Biden orbit and incoming administration, what do you hear about their expectations for relations with your region, both in Southeast Asia and in China writ large? Susan mentioned some of the statements that Tony Blinken made, confirmation hearing. We've seen Jake Sullivan tweeting quite a bit on issues related to Hong Kong and China and others. What is the expectation from your sense of their approach towards China, Asia, and Southeast Asia in particular?
Well, there has been a lot of appreciation in the last 4 years, despite all the sort of static. There was a lot of appreciation for Donald Trump's pushback against China, but only the way it was done, which went on very badly and produced backlashes. It produced Chinese sentiment widely in America. It hardened nationalistic sentiment among the people in China and so forth, because megaphone diplomacy, name calling, the China virus, Kung flu, all that stuff goes on very badly, certainly in that part of the world. So it's been a tremendous sense of relief that foreign policy is back in the hands of people who are really fairly experienced. And not to say that Trump team was inexperienced. I mean, they had some good foreign policy people, but this team is sort of head and shoulders above that. We have, of course, Kurt Campbell is a very familiar face, Jake Sullivan and so forth, Tony Blinken as well.
Kurt Campbell, who just to explain our listeners and watchers, Kurt Campbell been appointed as the chief coordinator in the National Security Council for the Indo-Pacific region, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs.
Right, absolutely, and the architect of the of the famed Obama pivot, which actually turned out to be rather wishy-washy.
I should say, I published pivot to Asia article that Kurt wrote for Hillary Clinton, and we had quite an internal fight, really, inside the Obama administration on that, even before it became controversial overseas.
Yeah. So I think there's a relief that this team has a lot of domain knowledge, and actually, as Tony Blinken said in his Senate hearing, he said it's actually to the advantage of the Joe Biden administration that the Trump administration had, and I saw this figure a couple ago, had unilaterally adopted something like 200 or even more actions on China, including all the tariffs and so forth. The last Congress moved over 380 pieces of legislation aimed against China. So, there's been a lot of baselines set down by the outgoing administration. And that is actually in one sense, it is inconvenient to Joe Biden, because if he sort of backpedals on any of those, if he rescinds anything, he will be accused immediately domestically of being soft on China, which is, one of the main lines of argument politically here. However, he doesn't have to. They can extract concessions from China, and they can just proceed on the basis of these baselines that have already been laid down. And I don't see them repealing any of them in a hurry. What they will do is reinstate conventional diplomacy and seek ways to cooperate with China on issues like climate change, pandemics, health. Getting back into the WHO will help in that respect. So America is basically back at the table. And that is very, very welcome news in Southeast Asia. We can get down to individual countries later. I think in terms of North Korea, instead of the sort of photo op summitry and somewhat magical thinking that sort of man-to-man summitry will suddenly change a third generation dictator and to give up the nuclear weapons, that's never actually going to happen. So that was fantastical thinking. But I think time there will be an actual bottom-up diplomacy, there will be negotiations, serious negotiations, and then it will be followed by whatever agreement they might come to, rather than putting the cart before the horse and looking at optics. And the one person who came out well from all that was Kim Jong-un, because he was being normalized as a nuclear power and even as a statesman by Donald Trump. So, the Joe Biden administration has a bit of a challenge there. But yeah, generally speaking, much relief that the US is back at the table and in the hands of experienced people who understand the nuances of the region and won't, ignite fires where it's not necessary.
Philip, when it comes to your part of the world, in Britain and Europe, you know a lot of these people who are coming into office in Washington. In fact, you know the president, who a frequent visitor to Europe, a frequent visitor to the Munich Security Conference, where we often meet. How do you see this team's approach to the world writ large, but also in particular towards Europe and the expectation in Europe what the Biden administration is going to deliver?
Well, I think to pick up from Nirmal, what Europe wants most from the United States is a great power that respects international agreements and rules and institutions and norms. And although in Joe Biden's speech, foreign policy, his inauguration address, foreign policy got, I don't know, 2 minutes out of 20, they were the right 2 minutes, as it were, in the sense that this, America as a guardian of a rules-based system was represented to the world. And I think in the initial moves, back into the Paris Climate Change Accord, suggestion that the US wants, if it can, be back into the Iranian nuclear accord, that rejoining the World Health Organization. This is the America that Europe wants to see, an America that's contributing and leading in the production of public goods, as it were. Now, within that, I think smart Europeans know that this is going to make it tougher on them, because as long as Trump was there and was not part of this game and was denigrating the EU and denigrating NATO, Europeans had an excuse to do nothing or not very much at all. I think the smart ones know, and we had a little bit of this from Angela Merkel this week, there's going to be some demands here from the US, and not just about spending a bit more on NATO, but on doing things on trade, on doing things on, the sort of management of the digital space, and other areas where Europe has to show that it too is it doesn't just talk the talk, but it contributes. So I think what we is a framework for cooperation within which there will undoubtedly be some serious arguments. Mrs. Merkel pointed out this week, that the United States still disagree about the Russian gas pipeline, so-called Nord Stream, which will pump Russian gas. But what she said was, we have a conversation about it, which includes, the whole energy relationship with Russia. With China, I think Europe now, I think the United States will rightfully expect Europe to back up some of its rhetoric about China as a strategic competitor with some action. Europe's just signed this investment relations pact with China, getting in, as it were, before Mr. Biden took office. Now there is a chance to begin to negotiate a joint approach to things like trade, to things about like technology. And I think the big question, both for Europe and the US over the next 3 or 4 years, is jointly they can be global standard setters in all these areas, in technology, in the in international rules and things like proliferation, and in climate change, if they want to be. But if they pull apart, for example, climate change, or they pull apart on how to treat the big technology companies, or how to deal with data, if they pull apart on those things, they're handing the game to China. And that's where the opportunity, but also some friction. But starting from the same place, space to have arguments.
Susan, China, both in this conversation and many of conversations we do here at Review, tends to be an important, was also dominating the Blinken and the Avril Haines the confirmation hearings, the new incoming, or in fact already confirmed, Director of National Intelligence. And yet in this White House and with this president, China, important issue, but so is Russia. And we've seen already in the sort of the first foreign policy step, besides rhetoric, have the issue of Russia from this president.
Well, that's right. It is ironic. It's like we used to say about the Middle East, right? You know, you can pivot away from it, but it doesn't pivot away. And I think that's sort of true on Russia as well, which actually has been kind of the newsiest dilemma to confront the now not quite 2-day-old Biden administration. We still got half an hour until it's actually been a 48-hour administration. So, you know, take that for what it is. But yes, and the reason is partially structural, because the New START treaty, which was negotiated by the Obama administration and is in fact the only remaining major nuclear arms control treaty in effect, this sort of frayed and almost disappeared regime of arms control, that is set to expire on February 5th. So there's really no time to delay. And so that was always going to be one of the first tests and one of the first issues that would arise foreign policy decision-making wise for the new Biden team. So yesterday, full day in office, they announced that they are planning not only to seek an extension as allowed for under the treaty, but Biden actually cut through, interestingly, some debate on emerging foreign policy team and just said, 5 years. We're not going to try to negotiate some arrangement or use our leverage with the Russians on this and get something else. We're just going to take this in effect off the table, because they knew that the Russians would agree to this 5-year, which is maximum extension, but it wasn't if they held that up or just asked for 1 or 2 years, as many of the new incoming Biden team wanted them to do. Biden, you know, clearly made this decision and said himself and said, no, we're just going to go for the longer term. So that's an interesting and potentially unfortunate timing, I think, for the Biden administration, because what's happening in Moscow this week, which they could not have anticipated, I think, when they probably made that decision on the 5-year extension, is the return to Russia of Alexei Navalny, the country's most important, significant, and serious dissident figure. He was arrested immediately upon arrival from Germany. This was after the Russians attempted to poison him with a banned chemical agent, Novichok. He sought refuge in Germany. They saved his life. He knew that he would face this kind of crackdown when he came back to Russia. He did it anyways. There's now scheduled to be a major march and demonstrations across Russia in support of Navalny on Saturday. The Putin administration seems to be freaking out about this. As you mentioned, Jake Sullivan, the new national security advisor, has tweeted support for Navalny. Biden and his team are immediately going to face very strong questions from the world, as they should. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? And so the convert these two things with Russia, as well as Biden asking Avril Haines, the new director of national intelligence, to do a fuller report on just exactly how bad was this Russian solar winds hacking. It's going to become, the very first foreign policy controversy of the new administration.
And we'll see, I guess, whether on this and so many issues, the administration can walk and chew gum at the same time, because diplomacy doesn't allow you neatly compartmentalize the good news and the good relationship with the nation while also dealing with the difficult steps. And Nirmal, it seems to me that's exactly what we're facing in China and the relationship with China as well. It's not just what does the United States and its allies want, but what does China want? And we saw already one immediate step: 28 senior officials of the former officials of the Trump administration banned coming to the Chinese mainland, Hong Kong, and Macau, as the first step coming out of Beijing to welcome the Biden administration, as one example, in retaliation for calling the Uyghur genocide a genocide, which is also happened. So how is China, as one actor, another country that you know well, India, how are they going to try to frame the world in which Biden is entering in order to pursue their interests.
Right. So I'm glad you brought up India, because another interesting legacy of the Trump years was the change of nomenclature from Asia Pacific to Indo-Pacific, and that effectively brought India in to bookend that zone. And then we saw, of course, the first joint level exercises of the Quad, which is Australia, Japan, US, and India. And India's Malabar exercises, all four took part at for the first time just a few months ago. And China was not very happy with that. They said, "Oh, it looks like the beginnings of a NATO for the region." But what's interesting is that India has always hedged its bets historically, but this time it has discarded its misgivings and more closely aligned with the United States because of its experience with China up on the Himalayan border. They've had a series of problems, as we know, the last few years. China's trying to make inroads, grabbing territory, coming to blows, and so forth. Pretty serious skirmishes out there. So and Joe Biden is thinking of holding a sort of global summit of democracies. And while that may not sit too well with some of the sort of hybrid regime in Southeast Asia, it'll sit very well with India as a democracy, and they have a much closer strategic link there. As far as China is concerned, China has for years just wanted to be recognized as the superpower in the region, the superpower in the room. That is how it has been comporting itself for the last 20 years, right? And so it sees itself as regaining its historical place in the world and the universe. That just happens to be what they think is their right? And from China's point of view, it is America which has got a semicircle of bases and allies around it, right? Which is hedging it in. It's America which is closely aligned to India. India is being used by America, and India is sort of rushing into the American embrace to counter China. So China's paranoid about this sort of scheme to keep China contained. So that is China's point of view, and I think they'd be quite. They should be open to a more considered, measured relationship with the United States. But there will be irritants. The genocide thing, the Uyghur issue is a huge problem. Human rights in Hong Kong, Taiwan is a huge, massive mountain, looming up ahead. Tony Blinken at his hearing said that America must make sure that Taiwan can defend itself. Taiwan should have a greater role in the world, and so forth. So Taiwan is something which is looming down the road. So there's a lot of potential for problems, and one has to just hope that these two countries, as ASEAN keeps saying, that they should restore some level of diplomacy and conventionality in their relationship to avoid stumbling into a kinetic conflict, which will be difficult to contain in the region, which is yet to stabilize after the, frankly, destabilization of the Trump era.
Philip, I want you to talk a little bit about a little more about China. You wrote a column about the idea of the allies getting together on a one China policy, that is all have one policy towards China. But I also want you to comment on this new opinion poll that the European Council on Foreign Relations just released the other day, which shows that overwhelming majorities of Europeans, of the public, wants to take a neutral stance if there is a conflict between the United States and China, that there is this sense that whatever differences there are between the United States and China, they are for them to resolve and not to have Europe dragged in. I know you don't agree with that. It is a reality of public perspective, and in some countries, in fact, it seems to be driving their policy. How is Europe going to deal with that issue?
Well, I think absolutely that Europe has some way to go. Europe has generally seen China as an economic opportunity rather than as a strategic rival or threat or competitor. And Germany in particular, one of the exporter to China, has pushed this policy about, look, essentially the Pacific is America's backyard, America's problem, we Europeans. I think, to be fair, that has been changing, and it's been changing for the last 2 or 3 years. We've seen China with its One Belt, One Road policy pushing west, and in Eastern and Central Europe being quite divisive and quite difficult. I think people have seen the way, and the Germans have seen this, the way China has been buying up technology and abusing intellectual property. So there was a change happening in Europe already. I think Trump, as I said earlier, gave the Europeans an excuse, because on the one hand, Trump was being sort of belligerent towards China. On the other hand, he was saying, but I want you to buy my soya beans. So I think what there now has to be on Europe's side is a one China policy, which says, yes, we have an economic partnership, but two, they are strategic rivals and they are a threat, a potential threat to us. And we have to put those together. And then we have to get together with the US. And I think Kirk Campbell's job at the White House will be very interesting, because I think it's an admission that the US hasn't been entirely consistent across the piece. There are parts of the administration that have always wanted to push the economic relationship, and other parts which have been hawkish. So what we need, I think, is a Western approach to China, which says at once it is, we can't wish away the economic interdependence. I don't think we can completely decouple, but equally we can't wish away the strategic threat. So we have to use your analogy, we have to compartmentalize and balance both of those things in dealing with. It's not impossible. We did it, different circumstances, but we did it during the Cold War. And I think there is I think Europe will need to be pushed to take notice of the strategic threat from China. Now, I think the opinion polls are probably, they were looking at Trump and China rather than necessarily what we would regard as a normal United States and China. And I think now there is an awakening. And I think what's happening to the Uyghur Xinjiang province is beginning to have a huge impact on Europe, because obviously we have our own memories of what happened in the 1930s and 40s with the Holocaust. And I think this idea that, a whole nation, as it were, is being imprisoned, interned. So I think European views of China are changing. I think we're becoming less mercantilist, more aware. And I think the Chinese aren't helping themselves. We have, for example, a Chinese ambassador in London who calls press conferences and uses them to give great lectures on what the British government should or shouldn't be doing, and also to threaten, China's response against things it doesn't like. So I think the Chinese have not actually been helping themselves either. So again, none of this is going to be easy, but I think one can see a policy which fuses the various strands in the relationship and actually pulls out between the US and Europe the common interests, which say we have to be tough here, but we can trade with them there. No one, I think, saying we mustn't trade with China, or China mustn't buy US treasuries or whatever.
Susan, I want to give you a chance to comment on the China issue from your perspective as you see it, but also if you would, the other issue that sort of is driving early on and was part of the confirmation here is the issue of Iran and the question of whether there is an ability to get back into the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, which of course the rest of the world would like the United States to do. The only question is whether the US and Iran can figure out how to do it.
Well, that's right. I do think it's worth spotlighting. It's the area where Republicans around Trump were most hawkish and most focused on, and in fact, actually, where Trump had the least interest. He had campaigned against the Iran nuclear deal and said it was the worst deal ever, aside from all the other things he said were the worst deal ever. So it wasn't really a surprise that he pulled out of it. But he never really evinced the extreme hawkishness of many of those who surrounded him. He in effect was very much along with the idea of kind of turning his Mideast policy over in a way to two U.S. partners, the Saudis on the one hand and the Israelis on the other. And that's where, to the extent he had achievements in foreign policy, certainly you have to say that the normalization of relations between the Israelis and certain of the Gulf Arab states, although notably not the Saudis, would come about. And the price of that was, I think, a reflexive view of the Middle East with Iran in the role as central villain, regardless of what practical fact the pulling out of the Iran deal had when it came to Iran's ability to further its nuclear program. By all accounts, it is actually done in the period of time of the Trump administration. So I thought it was very interesting that in his confirmation hearing, Tony Blinken said, in fact, yes, we'd like to read, but only if Iran resumes following the conditions that are contained within that deal, which they clearly are no longer doing as a result of pulling out. So I think there's going to be a sort of game of chicken here, who's going to be the first to make a move that determines things. I did see an interesting development this morning that Twitter finally banned the account of the Ayatollah Khamenei because he tweeted out, or someone using that account tweeted out a photograph of Donald Trump on his golf course with an Iranian drone appearing to, loom over him as if in attack. And, you heard a lot of Republicans complaining vociferously about the deplatforming of Trump and other Republicans in the wake of the Capitol attack on January 6th, and pointing out in a way that was, I think, quite embarrassing, that Twitter had deemed the president of the United States a threat than the supreme leader in Iran. So we'll see if that's a permanent ban or not. Why do I bring that up in the context of what the Biden administration is going to do? Because foreign policy in the last 4 years has been politicized, I think, like never before in Washington. And of course, it was always kind of bogus, and yes, this notion that foreign policy and politics stops at the water's edge for America. That was actually never really true, as we all know well. But it was like one of those kind of comforting cliches that at least there tended to be the aspiration for it to be true in some ways. And so, I just think this is the area, on one hand, where we can do most to quickly to tell the world that the U.S. is back. On the other hand, I also think that for Republicans on Capitol who were not so eager to defend some of the more unseemly aspects of Trump's last 4 years, that it's an easy way to return to their partisan instincts of the last few years. And you see that already with, Tom Cotton, the hawkish senator from Arkansas, attacking, prospective Biden era appointees for their views on Iran. And so I predict that this issue of Iran in the Middle East, as it was for the previous nations, will remain perhaps the most hyper-partisan area of our foreign policy here in Washington.
Well, and I think that's a good prediction for the future for all of us to look at, and Iran may in fact not be the issue that divides as much the European and the Americans forward, but the issue of deplatforming and the role of these big social media companies and how they should or should not be regulated, for sure is going to be an issue. I note that Angela Merkel, for example, was deeply troubled by the decision by Twitter and Facebook to throw Trump off the platform, because she didn't think that private companies should make those decisions. all big issues that we will have to leave for another time. It's been an extraordinarily rich discussion on a lot of good news, but a lot of hard work still to be done in the weeks and months ahead. And the good news is we'll be back next week to have a discussion about these issues. In the meantime, I want to thank Susan Glasser, Nirmal Ghosh, and Philip Stevens for their today and joining us hopefully soon again for another edition of Worldview. Thank you all and have a great weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.